Have you ever heard of Goliath, the giant? But what many don't know is that he wasn't alone. Imagine a world dominated by enormous and powerful beings that challenged God himself. These giants almost changed the course of history. But wait, did they disappear forever? Or could we see them again in the apocalyptic events that are yet to come? Stay until the end and discover the secrets of the last giants from a lost world. The Nephilim, first mentioned in Genesis 6:4, have always sparked curiosity among those who study the scriptures. These giants, the result of the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, stand out as mysterious figures in biblical history. The idea of powerful beings inhabiting the earth before the flood raises numerous questions about their origin and purpose. Were they part of a greater plan or a consequence of something beyond human control? The apocalypse, though distant for them, was already beginning to unfold, and the presence of the Nephilim might have been a harbinger of the tribulation to come. The question of who exactly the sons of God were is also a point of debate. Some scholars believe that these sons were fallen angels who defied divine orders, while others point to the lineage of Seth, one of Adam's sons. In any case, the result was the creation of a race of giants that defied the natural order of things. God's promise of a world governed by faith and the glory of his name seemed threatened by the presence of these beings. Forgiveness was not on the table for the Nephilim, for their existence symbolized a severe violation of divine laws. These giants became a force of opposition to the divine plan, and their impact on society at the time was so significant that it led God to intervene drastically. The flood was a way to purify the earth of all corruption, including the Nephilim. But were these giants completely eradicated? The book of Numbers 13:33 mentions the presence of giants in the land of Canaan, suggesting that, in some way, some survived the great cataclysm. The promise of a world purified by water seemed to leave remnants of this ancient threat. Presence of the Nephilim was not limited to physical strength. They represented a spiritual resistance against God's plans. Their actions, often violent and uncontrollable, but the balance between good and evil at risk. The end of the world, for them, seemed tied to their own existence, as their survival depended on breaking the barriers established by God. But the glory of God manifested clearly, eliminating these giants as part of his promise of redemption for humanity. Goliath is undoubtedly the most famous giant in the scriptures. Originating from Gath, he appears in 1 Samuel 17 as a fearsome warrior who challenges the army of Israel and provokes one of the Bible's most iconic confrontations. Standing over 3 meters tall and equipped with a bronze armor weighing about 57 kilograms, Goliath represented the ultimate physical threat. However, the confrontation with David, a young shepherd armed only with a sling and his faith in God, revealed much more than a simple battle of strength. It was a clash between earthly power and the glory of the Lord. Goliath trusted in his strength and stature, scorning any adversary not on his level. But it is interesting to note how Scripture emphasizes the difference in approach between Goliath and David. While Goliath came to battle with heavy weaponry and excessive confidence, David placed his trust in Jesus, the name that represented for him the promise of victory and protection. "You come to me with a sword, spear, and shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts," David declared. Samuel 7 verse 45, demonstrating that even in the face of tribulation, faith is the most powerful weapon. The confrontation between David and Goliath was not just a physical victory, but also a spiritual one. Goliath symbolized not just a military force, but resistance against the people of God. His defeat at the hands of an inexperienced young man served as a reminder to Israel and the world that God's glory does not lie in weapons or stature, but in the faith of those who trust in him. This event became an eternal lesson on how the power of God can overcome any obstacle, even those that seem invincible to human eyes. After Goliath's defeat, his story continued to reverberate through the generations, not just as a tale of courage, but as a clear example of how pride and trust in earthly things can lead to ruin. Goliath was feared by many, but his fall was quick and decisive. Thus, his figure became a reminder to the faithful that, regardless of the size of the threat, hope in God and trust in His promises will always prevail. This battle symbolized the constant struggle between flesh and spirit and showed that, even in the most desperate situations, God never abandons His people. It is also interesting that Goliath was not the only giant in the Bible. His story opened the door for a deeper exploration of his family and other giants who inhabited the earth at that time. Goliath's brothers, for example, were also among the last remnants of a world that was disappearing. Each of them represented a new threat, but like Goliath, they all eventually fell before God's mighty ones. And this leads us to explore the identity of these brothers and what they represented in the biblical context. Goliath's brothers are mentioned discreetly in the scriptures, but play an important role in the narrative of the giants. In 2 Samuel 21:15-22 and 1 Chronicles 24-8, we read about these giants, who, like Goliath, were fearsome warriors and represented a continued threat to the people of Israel. These giant men were not just members of an imposing physical lineage, but also symbols of resistance against God's plan for His people. Each of Goliath's brothers carries an aura of mystery. What is known is that they shared the same bravery and arrogance led Goliath to ruin. Among Goliath's brothers, we have Ishbi-Benob, who almost managed to kill David in battle, but was interrupted by Abishai, one of David's mighty men. Ishbi-Benob was an imposing warrior, wielding a spear that weighed more than 3 kilograms. Like Goliath, he relied on his physical strength and weapons, but was defeated by the intervention of a faithful servant of David. This victory shows once again, glory belongs to those who place their trust in God and not in their own strength. Another brother mentioned is Saph, or Sipai, defeated by another Israelite warrior. Saph is described as a giant from Gath. Just like his brother Goliath, and his fall at the hands of an Israelite reinforces God's continued promise that He would protect His people against their enemies, regardless of their size or strength. Each of these battles reveals the constant confrontation between faith and resistance to the divine plan. Tribulation was intense, but hope remained alive among Israel's mighty men, who knew that with Jesus by their side, nothing could defeat them. Additionally, another notable brother of Goliath was Lami, whose spear was as large as a weaver's beam. He, too, met his end at the hands of the Israelites, proving that no matter how great the lineage of giants, it could not defeat God's chosen people. These giants, who seemed invincible to human eyes, fell one by one, reinforcing the lesson that God's promise to protect and guide His people never failed. The physical strength of the giants could not compete with the spiritual power of the warriors of faith. David's mighty men were notable figures in Israel's history, known for their courage and loyalty to the king and God's plan. They were not just skilled warriors, but men of deep faith, who firmly believed in God's promise of protection and victory. Among their many feats, the battle against the giants, including Goliath's brothers, stands out. These men, who could easily intimidate any army, found resistance in a group of warriors whose hearts were firmly rooted in faith and divine glory. The battle against the giants was not just a physical confrontation, but also a spiritual one. These giants represented not only resistance to the people of God, but also a link to a corrupt and chaotic past before the promises made to Israel. Each victory won by David's mighty men symbolized the overcoming of obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The faith of these men allowed them to face challenges that, at first glance, seemed impossible to overcome. It was tribulation personified in flesh and bone, but trust in Jesus always prevailed. Joab, Abishai, and Benaiah are among the best known of the mighty men. They participated in decisive battles and were responsible for eliminating many of the remaining giants. In 2 Samuel 23, we see the list of David's mighty men and their accomplishment. Each of these men had a story of overcoming and an unshakable faith in the Lord. Their actions show that true strength does not reside in muscles or weapons, but in the spirit, fueled by faith and hope in the glory that God had promised His people. These men were willing to face any giant because they knew they did not fight alone. The victory over the giants also represented the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase for Israel. The scriptures show us that after these battles, the giants, who were once a significant force, began to disappear. The end of the giants symbolizes the decline of a lost world. Chaos reigned, and the rise of a new order established by God, where peace and divine promise prevail. It was a change that not only influenced Israel but echoed in the surrounding nations, showing that God's people had a protector, much more powerful than any physical adversary. David's mighty men's actions not only ensured Israel's safety, but also inspired future generations. They demonstrated that with faith and courage, any challenge can be overcome. Every giant that fell represented a victory of faith over fear, divine promise over brute force. These mighty men did not seek glory for themselves, but for the name of God, and that is what set them apart. They were God's instruments to eliminate the last remnants of an era of darkness and bring new hope to Israel. Giants were not exclusive to the Hebrew Scriptures. Accounts of enormous, powerful, and often feared beings appear in various ancient cultures around the world. These stories helped shape myths and beliefs in many civilizations, many of which saw giants as semi-divine or cursed beings. For the peoples around Israel, the presence of giants was seen as a sign of supernatural strength and often as a threat. However, for Israel, these giants represented something much deeper, a direct opposition to the divine plan and the promise of redemption. In Egypt, Babylon, and ancient Greece, stories of giants were part of local mythology. The Egyptians spoke of colossal beings who helped build their great pyramids, while the Babylonians had their own versions of divine beings powerful enough to challenge the gods. In Greece, titans and giants were part of the cosmogony, being figures that fought epic battles with the gods of Olympus. These accounts show that the idea of giants was rooted in a common understanding that, at some point in history, beings larger than life walked the earth, bringing tribulation and fear to nations. The presence of giants also influenced how the nations around Israel viewed war and military strategy. Many armies believed that with the help of these gigantic beings, they could dominate neighboring nations and expand their territory. In Deuteronomy 2:10-11, we see mention of peoples like the Emim and the Anakim described as giants who inhabited the land. The mere mention of these beings caused fear and provoked complex defense strategies. However, for Israel, God's glory always surpassed the giants' physical strength. The giants in the Bible were not only imposing physical figures, but also carried profound spiritual symbolism. They represented resistance to God's plan, and in many aspects embodied the forces of evil that opposed the divine will. These giants were more than tangible enemies. They were symbols of spiritual tribulations that God's people had to face and overcome. The story of David against Goliath, for example, is a clear reminder that amidst tribulation, faith in Jesus is what truly leads us to victory. It was not Goliath's physical strength that mattered, rather God's glory manifested through David's faith. Spiritually, the giants can be seen as obstacles that God's people encounter on their journey of faith. They represent fears, doubts, and resistances that try to prevent the fulfillment of divine promises. The victory over these giants in the Scriptures reflects God's ability to overcome any challenge, no matter how large it may seem. In Numbers 13:33, when the Israelite spies saw the descendants of Anak, they said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." This view of smallness before physical giants is a powerful metaphor for the spiritual challenges that often make us feel insignificant. The symbolism of the giants is also related to pride and arrogance, characteristics that directly oppose humility and submission to God. The giants, with their colossal strength, often saw themselves as invincible, relying solely on their power. However, the Bible constantly reinforces that pride precedes a fall. Proverbs 16:18. Just as Goliath fell before David, spiritual giants also fall before those who trust in God's strength. They are reminders that even when we face enormous tribulations, our faith in Jesus gives us the strength to overcome. Another layer of the spiritual symbolism of giants is the challenge they represent to God's kingdom. Just as the giants tried to prevent Israel from advancing to the Promised Land, we also face forces that try to prevent the advancement of God's kingdom in our lives and the world. These giants can manifest as temptations, oppressions, or belief systems that oppose the gospel. But just as God enabled the Israelites to defeat the physical giants, He enables us to overcome the spiritual giants that stand in our way. Finally, the symbolism of giants reminds us that the real battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil. Ephesians 6:12. The giants may have disappeared from the earth, but what they represent spiritually is still present in our lives. They challenge us to trust fully in God's promises and to face every tribulation with the confidence that, in Christ, we are already more than conquerors. The fall of the giants in the scriptures points to the end of an era of resistance to God's plan and the rise of a new world guided by His promises. The decline of the giants marks the end of an era that for a long time defied the order established by God. These imposing beings who once dominated lands and instilled fear began to slowly disappear after David's reign. The fall of the giants was not just a physical victory for Israel, but also symbolized the end of a corrupted and lost world, where resistance to God's plan was palpable. The last giants, eliminated by David's mighty men, represented the end of a lineage that no longer had a place in the future that God was shaping for His people. The tribulation they represented came to an end, and God's promise began to flourish. The exact cause of the giants' disappearance is not detailed in the scriptures, but it is clear that God's judgment played a fundamental role. The era of the giants was an era of chaos and disorder, a time when evil seemed to prosper. The flood was the first great act of purification, but even after that event, some giants continued to survive. However, over time, these remnants were defeated by God's warriors. The apocalypse for these giants did not come with great catastrophes, but through divine action via His faithful servants. God's glory was becoming more and more evident. The decline of the giants can also be seen as a metaphor for the decline of evil in the world as God's plan advanced. These beings represented a direct opposition to the divine order, and their disappearance signaled the establishment of a new era of hope for Israel. It was a lost world being gradually restored by divine intervention. The fall of the giants showed that, no matter how strong or invincible evil may seem, it cannot stand against God's will. The tribulation these creatures caused was finally overcome by the faith and perseverance of God's people. The end of the giants also coincided with the strengthening of Israel's kingdom under the leadership of David and later Solomon. David's reign, marked by battles against these beings, and Solomon's reign, marked by peace and the construction of the temple, symbolized the transition from an era of war to an era of glory. God's promise was being fulfilled, and the disappearance of the giants was a sign that the chaos that dominated the ancient world was finally being overcome. It was a new beginning for Israel and, in many ways, for the world. This new era, free of giants, allowed God's people to focus on His worship and on following His laws, without the constant physical threat of ancient enemies. The decline of the giants showed that evil, no matter how powerful it is temporary in the face of the eternity that God offers. With the end of the giants, Israel could experience relative peace and live in the hope, divine promises. However, even though the physical giants had disappeared, their spiritual legacy, as we saw earlier, continued to challenge God's people. In apocalyptic literature, there are mentions of a return of ancient and powerful forces in the last days. Some traditions associate the giants with the corruption of the pre-flood world and suggest that in the end times, this same kind of corruption might return. In Daniel 2, for example, we find the vision of the statue with feet of iron and clay, an image that represents divided and weakened kingdoms. Some scholars speculate that this fragility of the feet may symbolize the resurgence of something ancient and dangerous, perhaps even beings similar to the giants who once inhabited the earth. God's final glory will be revealed at that moment, just as it was in the time of David and his mighty men. The idea of giants returning in the end times can be understood either symbolically or literally. Symbolically, they represent the final resistance of evil before the return of Jesus and the establishment of God's kingdom. In Revelation, we read about the final battle between the forces of good and evil. It is possible that the giants represent this evil that rises one last time, only to be defeated by divine glory. God's promise of redemption and victory over evil is clear. And even if physical giants do not reappear, what they symbolize will certainly be present in the spiritual battles precede the end of the world. Now, tell me, do you believe that the giants could return in our days, or do you think they are just symbols of a past era? Leave your opinion in the comments. I really want to know what you think. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to keep exploring these incredible biblical mysteries. See you in the next video.